Good evening. Welcome. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History at the CUNY Graduate Center, and it is my pleasure, as always, to welcome you to tonight's conversation. If you are unfamiliar with the Gotham Center, as always, I invite you to learn more about us online at gothamcenter.org, where you can find nearly 1,000 articles, dozens of podcasts, digital exhibits, event recordings, and more on all things New York City history. Those of you looking for a more interpersonal experience should also check out Gotham Ed, our online education program, which offers mini courses by leading experts. You can find those courses soon at gothamed.com. Tonight, as part of our regular series featuring some of the best and most interesting research on New York City history, we'll be discussing this excellent new book from Nancy McDonnell, Empresses of 7th Avenue, World War II, New York City, and the Birth of American Fashion. If you're watching this event, you surely know that names like Calvin Klein, Ralph Lauren, Donna Karan, Marc Jacobs are some of the biggest in fashion. If you're anything like me, you're probably surprised to learn that these men were generally anonymous figures before World War II. As our guest tonight explains, even though 7th Avenue and the Garment District were long considered headquarters of American apparel in the United States, designers in New York simply copied the French rather than innovating, because style, all the very serious people understood, came from Paris, not Manhattan, and such had been the case since the 17th century. But the Nazi invasion of France in 1940 put an end to all that. The designers, retailers, editors, and photographers on 7th Avenue, however, seized the moment and began turning out clothes that were sophisticated but affordable, modern but comfortable, and established what came to be known as, quote, the American look by the end of the war. This is not a familiar story, even to students of fashion history, but none of it was possible, our speaker adds, without the ingenuity of a small group of women who are even less or even more forgotten until now. Empresses of 7th Avenue explains how these women put American fashion on the world stage and helped create the largest fashion industry in the world and the template for modern style. I won't say any more, but allow me to briefly introduce our guests before we start. Nancy McDonnell is a fashion historian and a fashion journalist. She writes the, quote, Fashion with a Past column at the Wall Street Journal, which I hope you all read, which explores the roots of current fashion trends. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Elle, Vogue, and many other publications, and she's the author of 5 books, including the classic 10, The True Story of the Little Black Dress, and 9 other fashion favorites. Nancy has been an adjunct lecturer at the Fashion Institute of Technology since 2018, where she teaches the history of 20th century fashion and fashion journalism. And she was born in Montreal and lives in Brooklyn with her family. We were hoping that we could be joined tonight by Lily Tuttle of the Museum of the City of New York, but due to an emergency, she will be unable to join. So unfortunately, you'll be stuck with me tonight. Before we start then, just one last bit of housekeeping. As usual, the chat and hand-raising features in Zoom have been disabled out of respect to our speaker. So if you do have a question, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. I encourage you to do so at any point in the next hour, and we'll begin answering those questions around 7:20 or so. So with that, please join me in welcoming our guests with some silent applause. Nancy, hello.
Peter, hello, how are you?
So glad to have you.
I'm delighted
Um,
to be here.
I hope that I can do Lily some justice. Thank you for joining us. This is the first event I think we've done on fashion history at the Gotham Center in my time.
Oh, I hope not the last.
I hope it's not the last. Your book was really interesting,
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to this conversation. So I'm just trying to get my P's and Q's in order here. I have
Okay.
questions to fire at you if you'll bear with me. Um, but maybe you can start by just telling us how you came to the book.
Mhm. Well, this period of between the wars and immediately after World War II has always really interested me, in part because between the wars, all of the top designers were women. Whether you're talking about Gabrielle Coco Chanel, Madeleine Vionnet, Elsa Schiaparelli. It was a time when really women dominated the fashion scene, certainly in Paris, which, as you were just explaining, was the generally acknowledged center of the fashion world. But there were a lot of very interesting women working in New York as well. And I thought that, as you said, many of them have been really unfairly forgotten. They played a major role in putting American fashion on the world stage. And I knew about many of them individually, but they all knew each other because they were working in this very small fashion world. This fashion world is small today, but it was even smaller in the 1930s and 40s. And I realized that in working together, that's really how this came about, that American fashion could really come onto the international scene.
So the status of fashion and garment design in the US before World War II,
Mhm.
does it mean that there are no American designers of note?
No. Prior to World War II, the US and in New York City in particular were known for their mass production capabilities, what the New Yorker fashion critic and one of the empresses, Lois Long, called the American genius for mass production. Um, the US led the world in terms of ready-to-wear production. Um, but although New York City did not have anything approaching the cachet of Paris, because of this mass production capability, it was generally acknowledged that American women were able to be well dressed because they had access to this incredible ready-to-wear industry. Um, and even Vogue, which was almost completely devoted to haute couture in this period, they came out with their very first Americana issue, as they called it, in February 1938. And they acknowledge this. They talk about how the American fashion industry allows so many women to be well dressed. But then they immediately qualify this by saying, but of course, the very best dressed women in the world are women in Paris who wear haute couture. So they're really struggling between their pride in the American industry and their as yet unshakable allegiance to Paris, which, as you said, had been the center of the fashion world since the 17th century. And there was this idea that still exists today that the French are good at fashion just because they're French. As I explained, it was actually very carefully plotted and implemented that, France became the world's first global luxury brand.
Yes.
As for American designers, there were some American designers who were names at this period, but they tended to be made-to-order designers. They were in effect couturiers themselves. People like Elizabeth Hawes, who is one of the women in the book, Jessie Franklin Turner, Valentina. But they had their own couture salons. They created made-to-order fashion. Most designers were backroom employees. They did not have their name on the label. They worked for manufacturers. Clothes were shipped without any labels in them, so that when they came to the store would put their label in it. If you bought a dress from Best in Company or Saks or Macy's, as a consumer, as far as you knew, the store had created the dress. So they were anonymous. The first person to really begin to change this was Dorothy Shaver of Lord and Taylor. She launched this campaign in 1932, which she called American Fashion for American Women. And she was treating designers as people that were interesting in and of themselves and who were creators, and she wanted people to know about them. She put their photographs in their display windows along with their clothes. She had events where, Lord and Taylor shoppers could meet and interact with them. This campaign lasted for about 8 years, and it introduced about 75 designers to the American public. But for the most part, they were completely unknown.
Um, uh, s- 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 so is it just the war and the occupation of Paris, or is there something else that's going on that
Mhm.
helps catalyze this shift? I mean, it's
Um,
surprising to me what you're talking about, but it makes sense.
Yeah, I know
Um,
it's so remote from what we have today, in which designers are celebrities, that it's difficult to remember this. But even as late as say the early 1960s, Bill Blass, who was a great American designer, would tell people that he worked in advertising rather than saying that he was a fashion designer because he thought that was more socially acceptable
yeah.
than being a fashion designer. So is there something else going on? Well, even if the war had not happened, American design would still have triumphed because ready-to-wear was just the way things were moving. There were more women entering the workforce. American lives were much more casual than those of women who actually wore haute couture. So ready-to-wear was clearly the future. As early as the 1920s, Elizabeth Hawes, one of the designers I just mentioned, um, was she didn't begin writing until the 30s, but she was already thinking that, a system that was founded on copying Paris, which is to say, copying haute couture fashion for a ready-to-wear market, just didn't make any sense. She knew that this could not continue. So it would have changed anyway. Um, American women were much more likely to work. They were more likely to play sports. They were more likely to um, participate in public life. At this point, remember, French women couldn't even vote. They didn't get the vote until after the occupation. So it was a very different style of life. Um, and American women needed clothes that fit these more casual lifestyles. And many of the women in the book, they're part of the first generation of women who really moved to other cities, who forged careers for themselves,
Right.
who perhaps decided not to marry or delayed getting married. Um, for example, Claire McCardle's family did not want her to move to New York to study design at Parsons. She started out her college career at Hood College in her hometown, and then finally persuaded her parents to let her move to New York and become a fashion designer. Lois Long, she came to New York after earning her degree at Vassar, and the first writing assignment she had for the New Yorker was actually she was their nightclub columnist. This was during Prohibition, so she essentially had a job that was involved engaged in illegal activities every night. This would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. So things were changing very much, and fashion is often at the forefront of this.
Well, I'm thinking about it from things that I'm more familiar with from my research, but
Hmm.
the teens and 20s is this sort of often regarded as this point in which the we move from a producer to a consumption based sort of economy. So the beginning,
Yes.
excuse me, lines of credit, and marketing, the birth of marketing, all these other sorts of things. So,
Hmm.
but then again, your story, it takes place in the 40s, so it kind of lends the notion of that like Paris had to kind of fall to Vichy for this to happen. I would have kind of said, well, isn't this kind of an organic piece of America also sort of increasingly dominating more and more of global economic market share?
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
know, if so, if things do not go the way they go in Paris in 1940, do you think it just happens much later? Is that what you mean by your answer, or do you
I
think
think
there's a
it happens more slowly. It's not as dramatic. This was, to quote Winston Churchill, don't let a good crisis go to
crisis go to
waste.
waste?
They really took advantage of that crisis. The U.S. Really emerged as the true victor after the war. American culture really that's when it begins to roll out all over the world. I think fashion was a part of that. Dorothy Shaver certainly recognized that. So I think it would have been slower and it would not have been as dramatic, but it still would have happened,
Yeah,
especially in the 60s when so many of the rules that had really told people how they could dress for decades, if not centuries, really fell away.
yeah. And what about we're the Gotham Center for New York City history. What about New York City in this story? Does this shift say something in particular about New York or the women uh, in New York in this period?
Mm.
Faber, McCardle,
Um,
Lambert, they're all arrivals from somewhere else.
they're all arrivals from
Story
somewhere else.
is a female centric story. They're
Hmm.
the ones powering this shift, and it seems remarkable in the context of post-war conventions that were to come.
Yes, yeah, the post-war period was certainly much more repressive. Um, they really took advantage of the post-World War I era in which more women were entering the workforce, were able to live independently, were getting college educations. So this was all part of it, certainly. And New York City was, as you know, the cultural capital of the United States. The population doubled between 1900 and 1930 because of all these people who were moving to the city to partake in this cultural life. So I think it's really part and parcel of that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is kind of to quote Mike Wallace, our founder. This
Hmm.
here when New York sort of becomes capital of the world.
Right. Yeah,
They
as we modestly call it.
right, yes. How does the title fashion is Spinach speak to this revolution? This is the book that I'm blanking on her name right now, but the
Elizabeth Hawes,
1930s.
yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Um, well,
and
readers of the
this,
time would have recognized this title immediately. It comes from a New Yorker cartoon that was very well known at the time. It depicts a mother and child sitting at the dinner table, and the mother is saying, "Eat your broccoli, dear." And the kid says, "I say it's spinach, and I say to hell with it." Um, so Hawes, the author, she was a fashion designer. She was also a writer, but what she really was an iconoclast. She was saying that fashion was always giving women what they didn't want, what they didn't need, i.e., spinach. She described fashion in her book as that horrid little man that tells you that you can't wear last winter's coat because it's not in fashion this year. It's not the current silhouette. You can't find a blue dress because we're not doing blue dresses this season. For Hawes, the idea that fashion was spinach was linked with what she called the French legend. This is the idea that all beautiful clothes come from Paris and all women want them. She articulated this, but this idea had been around for centuries. She spent 3 years in Paris. She went there to learn how to be a couturier, and she went as a full believer in the French legend. Um, but she became completely disillusioned in her time there. She realized that French couturiers were only interested in dressing the very wealthy women whose entire lives revolved around being chic in a way that it's very difficult for us to contemplate today. They changed their clothes multiple times a day. They had ladies' maids whose sole jobs were to look after their wardrobes and help them get dressed and fix their hair. Um, she said it made no sense for American women to base the clothes that they wore on this lifestyle because that was not the lifestyle that, American women were leading. She wanted Americans to have their own fashion legend, which is what the story of Empresses of Seventh Avenue is.
right.
Um, but to delve a little deeper, Hawes thought that women as well as men should just should question the accepted way of doing things. To her, the status quo was suspect. And you really see this in her writing as well as in her fashion. She went on to write 7 other books after Spinach, which was a New York Times bestseller. She worked for PM, the short-lived left-leaning New York newspaper. And in her writing, she addressed topics that were not considered polite. She wrote that women's health was worthy of study, that men and women should share childcare equally, and that if a man wasn't prepared to commit to, 30% of the childcare for a week, he shouldn't get married. She was really an agent of change. Unfortunately, she closed her fashion house down in 1940, so we don't see what she would have done after that. She went to, first she worked for Wright Aeronautics, the biggest aeronautics firm, wartime firm at the time. And then she moved to Detroit and she became a labor organizer. And she ended up being blacklisted by the FBI, who actually confused her with another Elizabeth Hawes, who had also gone to Vassar, who was even more radical than our Elizabeth Hawes. Um, so, tells you
How
something about
unlike
the
the
FBI
FBI
right
these
there.
days.
And she never knew that she'd been blacklisted. She tried to
Mhm.
start her career again. She was not able to. Her customers wouldn't come back. She never knew why her life became derailed in this way. But she was always on the side of style rather than fashion. She liked full skirts because she said you can move more easily in them, and she liked them whether they were in style or not. She tells the story in her memoir about she's walking down Fifth Avenue one day in the 1930s, and she's not wearing makeup and she's wearing a full skirt. And Andrew Goodman, one of the owners of Bergdorf Goodman, spotted her and was apoplectic with rage that she dared to present herself in public this way. She also got married in jeans in 1938, so 1937 rather. So she was a lady ahead of her time.
Sounds like later no.
Hmm.
Um, so related to the question above,
Hmm.
what were Clara McCardle's key inventions? How do they speak to the larger cultural, social themes that were set to explode in the post-war era?
Well, McCardle is often described as the mother of American sportswear. Today we think of sportswear as clothes that you actually wear to play sports. But at the time, it just meant more casual clothing. Again, to us, this wouldn't especially look casual. We're still talking about skirts, for example. Um, but it's more casual. And this was the type of clothing that American designers really excelled at producing and that couturiers were not so interested in. McCardle herself defined it as clothing uninfluenced by Paris. So we're talking about more comfortable cuts, more practical fabrics that are easier to care for, clothes that are more flexible in terms of how and where they could be worn. And unlike Elizabeth Haas, who had her own couture house, McCardle was a Seventh Avenue designer, which was to say that she made ready to wear. You know, she was an employee at a firm, and her clothes were designed to be cut and sewn by the hundreds, not for one person at a time. So she had to think of that in her designs, which is not to say that her designs were boring. You know, she approached fashion from the point of view of what do I need, and she was very inventive in answering that question. So she really is the mother of American sportswear. Designers continue to look at her collections. You know, after her death, her wardrobe was donated to FIT. People still go to see it. She still influenced Tory Burch, an American designer who's in this vein, did an entire collection that was inspired by Claire McCardle a few seasons ago. Um, so she's had an enormous impact. I would actually like to see a bit more of Hawes's attitude in the industry, to be honest. She was really unafraid to say and do what she thought was right. But her name is almost completely forgotten today, even though she was in many ways the catalyst for everything that was to follow, because she went public with her ideas about the French legend, which, you know, got people to question it. If I could go back to 1940, I would certainly persuade her to keep her house open and maybe not go to Detroit and be a labor organizer. McCardle is really a designer's designer, you know, at least for American designers. I've met plenty of Europeans who have never heard of her. But she died young. You know, she died of cancer when she was only 52. I would love to have seen what she would have done in the 1960s when, you know, as I said, so many of these rules that governed fashion began to fall away. Um, and that whole revolution really favored American designers who had always leaned this way anyway. But she really was instrumental in giving American fashion the respect that it deserved. I can't hear you, Peter.
Sorry about that. There was a siren going by before.
That's okay. It
Um,
happens.
so we've talked about two of the main characters in your book,
Hmm.
McCardle and Hawes.
Yeah.
Um, and you've already kind of said a bit about this, but how do you sort of assess their legacy then? Or these are women who basically aren't they obviously leave a big they're catalysts. They leave a big
Hmm.
impact, but because of the sort of idiosyncrasies of their careers and circumstance, they just don't get the credit they deserve. How would you sort of
Hmm.
summarize that legacy? Why are there other reasons why they're forgotten? Um,
I think they did a lot of the behind the scenes work, you know. They weren't the designers who eventually did get their names on the labels and who got more press. And some of them, I think a part of it is just time. You know, this was a long time ago. Some of them died young, as Claire McCardle did. Dorothy Shaver also died in her 50s. Lois Long was supplanted at the New Yorker by another fashion writer. I think
we're going to
time
get to
moves
these.
on.
We're going to get to Dorothy and others in a
Oh
minute.
yeah, we'll talk about her. Yeah. I think, yeah, and also fashion very rarely gets a lot of respect. You know, it's
Mm,
something that is considered a feminine pursuit,
right,
something that's not worthy of serious study. You know, fashion
right,
history as a field didn't really exist until just a few decades ago. I think
right.
that's a big part of it.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. Um, so let's talk about Dorothy.
Let's talk
Dorothy
about Dorothy
Saber.
Shaver.
There's a lot to say about her impact on American
Hmm.
retail.
Yeah.
Maybe just start with who she is, but then, how does she see her role? Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
uh, she combines showmanship, the idea of upholding the tradition of the Medicis,
Hmm.
her patriotism,
Hmm.
how does that factor in the support for quote intrinsically American clothes? There's a lot to say here, but
Yeah. So Dorothy Shaver grew up in a small town in Arkansas, and she and her sister first moved to Chicago. Her sister was an artist. They lived together throughout their lives, and neither of them ever married. They lived in Chicago, but they weren't quite satisfied with that. They wanted to be in New York, so they moved to New York. And they first supported themselves by these dolls that her sister made, which they opened up a store. It was very successful. There was a fad for this kind of thing in the early 1920s. Um, but her sister got tired of doing that. She wanted to go back to painting. They closed the store down, and Dorothy Shaver ended up going to work for Lord and Taylor. I believe there was a family connection somehow. It was either a family friend or an actual connection who was an executive at Lord and Taylor, and that's how she began working there. And she started out working in their comparison shopper bureau, which all department stores of the era had. And department stores were where everybody shopped. Even small communities had several. And they were really they were centers, pillars of their community. Lord and Taylor, because New York being a big city, had many department stores. They lined Fifth Avenue from the Park down to the 30s, even the 20s.
Graduate
They're almost
Center,
all gone
the
today.
B. Altman Building. Yeah.
Exactly, yes. They're almost all gone today. So she was a comparison shopper, which consisted of going around to other department stores and seeing what they sold and what they charged for it. And she said it would make a lot more sense if we just concentrated on what we sold and didn't think about that so much. She ended up becoming the head of this bureau. She became a vice president in charge of advertising. She
What
eventually
is
became the.
maybe just say what is comparative I'm sorry, comparative shopper bureau?
Shopping. It was
Yeah.
like being a spy, really. You'd go to other stores and see what they were selling, what they charged for it, what their services were like, what their salespeople were like. It was like industrial espionage, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what she started out doing. But she got into the advertising and promotion side of things. She said that when she started at Lord and Taylor, they had about as much of a sense of showmanship, as she said, as a high school play. Um, a high school in the 1920s. I'm sure today it would be quite different. She said they were selling clothes and furniture, but they were not selling fashions and living and ideas. She always had this more conceptual way of thinking about a store. So that's what she brought to Lord and Taylor, the sense that a store could be more than a store. It could be a tastemaker, it could be a leader in
Right.
style and in thought. She had her first big success in 1928, and it was not with fashion, it was actually with furniture and home decor. 3 years earlier, we had had the Exposition des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, from which the term Art Deco comes from, Art Décoratif. The US had not participated in this. The American government turned down the chance to send any artists there, and the style was a little slower to catch on in the US than it was in Europe. So she went to Europe. She spent 6 months traveling around France, buying the best furniture that she could, and she staged this enormous exhibition on the 8th floor of Lord and Taylor. She had all these little rooms set up with that she furnished. It was the first time many people had seen modern French painters. It was open for something like 3 months, and 300,000 people trooped through Lord and Taylor, which, a museum would be happy to get that many people in a year. And it
Yep.
was really recognized as the tipping point to when this style began to be picked up in the US through her efforts. And then she thought a few years later that maybe she would do this with American design, but she decided to switch to fashion because she said there were all these great designers that people just didn't really know about. And that's when she started her American Fashions for American Women campaign in 1932. She was a bit like the Diana Vreeland of retail. She wanted to zhuzh things up to make it more exciting, to make it not just about stuff, but about ideas and dreams and, a way of living. She positioned Lord and Taylor not just as a place to shop, but a place how to learn good taste, to learn how to have a cultured life. To her, Lord and Taylor was not just a retailer, it was a center of the community, a community leader. She established these Lord and Taylor American Design Awards that were originally just for fashion. They grew to encompass, science, technology. She saw Lord and Taylor as celebrating and encouraging the best of American ingenuity.
So this is a unique approach at the time, and her
Hmm.
innovation um, in retail, what sort of creates, uh, how does that impact the fashion revolution that's sort of happening around her?
Hmm. Well, she supports American designers. She was a big supporter of Claire McCardle. Um, but she's really doing a lot of it through the advertising, which was very sophisticated for the time. She didn't, stack the advertising with six different dresses on a page. She would choose one, it would be really big, and it was very beautifully rendered. She worked a lot with an artist named Dorothy Hood. And she said the idea is not to sell a particular dress. The idea is to sell the idea that we know fashion. This is where you
Mhm.
come to become an informed person. So her second big campaign was called the American Look. So in the waning months of the war, it was clear that it was going to end soon, and foremost on the minds of everyone in Seventh Avenue was the French will be back. We've made all of these strides, but soon they're going to come back, and we're going to face that competition again. Um, so there was a renewed effort to keep promoting American fashion. What Dorothy Shaver created was this American Look campaign. And it was really she was placing American fashion in the context of American culture, and other accomplishments. She talked about how American fashion was democratic, that there was no other place in the world where society women and, say, a secretary would shop at the same store, i.e., Lord and Taylor. She believed this was its strength and this was its appeal. So she had this series of ads, all of which celebrated a different segment of what she saw as, the American fashion consumer. It might be a businesswoman in one, or a college student in another. And in all of them, she talked about the freshness and casualness and ease of American fashion and how American women live these lives. Um, and there were stories in, like, for example, Life did an extended piece that was really like a long PR release for the American Look, in which they photographed Shaver and her executives choosing models. They defined what the American Look was. Other magazines did stories on, the American Look diet. Life even followed that up with a French look, which they said was more artificial and sexier and took more effort than the more natural American look. Um, but she said the American look will be widely copied, just like our Jeeps and our movies, our distinct contributions, our fashion will be. And she said one day it's going to be a real compliment to be told, you look so American. So it was part of this post-war explosion of American culture and influence in Europe and around the world, really.
Yeah, which still resonates. I can say that as someone
Hmm.
most of his family is in Europe.
Hmm.
Um, so the third piece of the puzzle we're putting together here,
Hmm.
the press and another character in your story, Eleanor
Hmm.
Lambert.
Eleanor
Um,
Lambert. Yeah.
uh, is this also, tell us how she fits into the story? And
Hmm.
the first question would be, again, how does New York City sort of,
Hmm.
what's the role that New York City is playing that's crucial in this?
Right. Um, so Eleanor Lambert moves to New York because she thought she wanted to be an artist. And it's the center, of course, of the American art world. She realized she was kind of mediocre at being a sculptor, and she wanted to be really good at something. So she went to work for a book publisher. This was in the mid 1920s, and at the time, which sounds very quaint today, but book publicists rather, would call up celebrities like, Mary Pickford or Douglas Fairbanks and ask them to promote books. And she would watch her boss calling up all these celebrities, and she thought it was just fantastic. She
They
said,
were influencers,
they
you
were
might say.
influencers. She would sit there with her mouth hanging open. And finally, he said, why don't you try this? She turned out to be an absolute natural at schmoozing people. So he encouraged her to start her own business. And he said, do what you know best. And she knew the art world. So she became a publicist for artists, who at the time did not get the kind of publicity that they do now.
Hmm.
And she promoted them by presenting them as interesting, well-rounded people, as she would describe it. She just went up to 57th Street, which was at that time the center of the of the art world in New York, where all the galleries were. And she just went from gallery to gallery and pitched her services at, I think, $10 a week. She ended up representing really a who's who of American artists at the time: John Curry, Walt Kuhn, Jackson Pollock, Isamu Noguchi. And she really became an integral part of the New York art world. She was part of the founding of the Whitney and of the MoMA, the American Art Dealers Association. She could have stopped right there and she would have had an incredible career. Um, and then one day in 1932, she got a call from a designer who said, "Can you do for me what you do for artists?" And it was just this light bulb moment for her, because she considered designers artists, and she decided that she was going to turn her attention to this. Um, this was not this was not an opinion that people thought was very valid. When she had lunch with her good friend Diana Vreeland and told her this, Vreeland kind of scoffed and said, "Eleanor, you're such an amateur. It doesn't work that way. People aren't going to be interested in American designers." But she really persevered. And her story really takes off during the war, when, of course, there's no Paris to promote, so American designers need to be promoted. New York starts to worry that other manufacturing centers around the country are trying to compete with it, so they found the New York Dress Institute to promote themselves. And Eleanor Lambert gets hired to be the publicist for it. They went with this other firm first, J. Walter Thompson, who created the first Listerine ads, trying to shame Americans into buying mouthwash. They resurrected this obscure medical term, halitosis. So they kind of used the same approach in fashion. They created this character called One Dress Beulah, and they tried to, shame basically women into buying more clothes.
Yeah.
This wasn't working. Lambert said, "That is a ridiculous approach. We need to do something different." So she created these ads to like really talk about the inspirations of American fashion, how it was really woven into the structure of New York City. There was one ad in which they have pattern pieces overlaying the city's skyline, like it's a part of the fabric of the city, the Fashion Institute. The very structure of the city. And this was literal. I mean, the garment district, which still exists today, but pretty much only in name, at that time, there were about 5,000 firms in this square mile of Manhattan, and they made about 80% of the clothes that Americans wore,
Yeah.
which seems crazy now that there was wide scale manufacturing in Manhattan. But that's how it worked. When fashion editors talked about covering the market, they were really literal. They would walk over to 7th Avenue and they would meet with manufacturers and designers. And this would become especially important once the war begins and the fashion press has no alternative but to cover American fashion. And this is when the press really begins to take American fashion seriously. Before that, it was much more of an afterthought, and many American fashion journalists had never even been to a presentation of an American designer. They were so focused on Paris. But there was no organized way of, there was no Fashion Week at the time until Eleanor Lambert decided she was going to create Fashion Week. She called it Press Week. She started it in 1943, and 7th Avenue, it was like herding cats, but she got them to commit to a schedule and they were going to show on the schedule. She paid the expenses of out-of-town journalists just from the US and Canada to come. And that was the start of New York Fashion Week, which was a multi-billion-dollar moneymaker for the city. But before that, there was no organized way that manufacturers showed their collections. She made them realize the importance of not just being manufacturers, but of promoting themselves. She really taught designers how to deal with the press, and the press how to cover designers. So she did all of this.
I mean, so this is if I could just add a bit to what you're saying, then it's New York being not just, I mean, it's all kinds of things. People of a certain generation anyway, or below a certain generation, are shocked to hear about the history of the city when it was a manufacturing city, when it actually had more capacity in terms of manufacturing than several other major cities combined. But it also had been for a very long time the media capital. So part of its advantage there, I mean, it's her brilliance in sort of putting these things together and thinking that we need to have some event that, but part of the way that the city becomes key here is that it also is this media capital in addition to being a sort of fashion Still in waiting, so to speak.
Yes, and this was at a time when magazines were at the very center of popular culture. Pre-television, people listened to the radio, but it was pre-television, obviously pre any sort of social media. So this is how fashion was disseminated. The two Bibles of American fashion were Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. Harper's Bazaar is actually older. It was founded just after the Civil War. Vogue
Mhm.
was founded in the 1890s. Prior to 1940, they were almost exclusively focused on Paris fashion. There was some
Mhm.
American fashion in there, but it was pretty much Paris, Paris, Paris. As one journalist later said, it was Paris, Paris, Paris. It made it very
Yeah.
hard for American designers to get any attention. But once the war, once Paris falls, they're planning their September issues, which we know from the film is the big important issue for magazines, and they completely refocus, and it's all about American fashion. Now, at the time, these magazines had this really intense rivalry. They were a bit like the Hatfields and the McCoys. The editor-in-chief of Vogue was Edna Woolman Chase. She started working there as a teenager in 1895. She worked in the mailroom. She becomes editor-in-chief in 1914, and she remains editor-in-chief until 1952. So this is a very long reign. So far, I believe she's the longest serving Vogue editor, but Anna Wintour is hot on her heels. So if she hangs in there a couple of more years, she will surpass Edna Woolman Chase. Carmel Snow used to work for Edna Woolman Chase. She was hired by Condé Nast, the person who named his company after himself, to be a fashion editor there. And he suggested to her that once Edna Woolman Chase retired, she would become the editor-in-chief. After 10 years, she realized this was never going to happen. So when she got an offer from Bazaar, she took it because she knew she really would become editor-in-chief. After that point, everyone at Vogue was instructed to never speak to Carmel Snow again. It was like she'd gone over to the enemy camp. When she retired about 25 years later, and there were stories being written about her, someone called up Vogue to get a quote about her time there. And the quote they got was that to talk about American fashion in relation to Carmel Snow is like talking about American history from the point of view of Benedict Arnold. So they had not forgotten that she had betrayed them by going over to the other side. Um, they both completely recalibrated their magazines to cover American fashion. And particularly Carmel Snow had two incredible employees who were also characters in this book who really helped to create what the American look would look like. This was Diana Vreeland, her fashion editor, and Louise Dahl-Wolf, a photographer. Um, in the 1930s, almost all fashion photography took place in the studio. It was because of the size of the cameras, the speed of the film. And then in 1936, Kodachrome for still film comes out. So this gives color photographs. Color photography becomes a part of fashion magazines. It's very, very tricky to use. A lot of color photographs from the time look like they've been colorized. But
Yeah.
Louise Dahl-Wolf's incredible strength was her eye and her ability to differentiate colors. When Carmel Snow saw her portfolio, she said, "At last, I knew that Bazaar was going to look the way I always wanted it to look." So she and Vreeland would go out into the American landscape and they would photograph clothes outdoors. One of the most famous shoots they did was called Flight to the Valley of the Sun. They went to Arizona in late 1941, about the time that, just before Pearl Harbor. They were probably in Arizona when that happened. It appeared in the January 1942 issue of Vogue, and it's this huge, beautiful landscapes. They shot at a Jude ranch. They shot on a Western film set. And in particular, they took these beautiful photographs outside of a Frank Lloyd Wright house with these incredibly modern looking clothes. If you compare the clothes in those editorials to, say, some of the ads that appear in Bazaar, there is no comparison. I talk about the Betty Grable, Ginger Rogers paradigm, which we have this image of 1940s fashion with giant pompadours and big shoulders and peep toe pumps. There is
Hmm.
none of that in a Vreeland and Dahl-Wolf story. The clothes look really modern. They're like very sleek. So they're putting these modern American clothes against modern American architecture, and they're saying they're both valid. They're both really good. So they're really showing this is what the American look looks like.
Okay, so there's this right. So there's this also changing way in which fashion magazines are presented in
Hmm.
the industry. And Lambert's special sauce, is this simply about timing being right for a figure like her, or just that she was the one that figured it out?
She has this wonderful quote. She says, "You always have to see what's right in front of you and
Yeah.
act on it," which is not as easy to do as it sounds. I think she saw that the time was right, um, and she pushed. She was known for being a very tough character, very pushy. You did not say no to her. She said, "If you won't let me in through the door, I'll come in through the transom." She was just going to make you see her point of view. Um, and in some ways, she really played the long game. The book ends with the Battle of Versailles, which takes place in 1973. So this is almost 3 decades after the American look is launched, after the end of the war. But I think Lambert had been planning it for years. She wanted not just Americans, but the French and the whole world to recognize the greatness of American designers. But she wanted the moment to be right. She knew that your timing had to be perfect. So, although the French made a huge comeback after the war, with Dior's new look, and the decade between 1947 and 1957 is often called the golden age of haute couture. Um, this didn't last. By 1973, Lambert's moment had come. The fashion revolution of the 1960s, which rejected, as I said, many of the unwritten dress codes that had existed for so long, that you had to wear a hat, that you didn't appear in public
Hmm.
without gloves, or stockings, or all of these things. Um, those fell away, and this falling away really favored American designers. Fashion became more casual, and ready to wear was really supplanting haute couture. When Balenciaga, for example, retired in 1968, he did not name a successor, because he didn't see a future for haute couture. He just didn't see it continuing after his death. Um, So when in 1972, or early 1973 rather, Lambert found herself poolside with a curator from Versailles who she knew needed money to restore the palace, which had fallen into complete disrepair. It was not at the time the beautifully restored structure that we know today. She told him, "I have an idea for how you might do that. It's kind of a crazy idea, but maybe you'll go for it." And she suggested that he have a fashion show and he sell tickets. But to make it interesting, don't just have French designers, have some American designers come. So he fell for it hook, line, and sinker, bah, and it was planned. So it's kind of like the Battle of Versailles, as it came to be called. This was what WWG nicknamed it. Was actually called the Grand Divertissement at Versailles. It was like a battle of the bands mixed with a fashion show. It was Paris couturiers against American ready-to-wear designers. And Lambert calculated that once the French knew that they were doing this, they would go into their usual over-the-top mode. And she was correct. They put together this kind of bloated, multi-hour extravaganza that was inspired by the court festivities of Louis XIV, because they're at Versailles. With a live orchestra, they had the dancers from the Crazy Horse, they had Josephine Baker. The Americans had none of this. In fact, the set that they brought with them was so small that the designer carried it to Paris in a duffel bag. When they got there and they unfolded it, they realized they'd been measuring in the wrong measurement system, so it didn't fit. They had to make one at the very last minute. There was only one rehearsal. It was the day before the show. The French just rehearsed first, and they took so long that the Americans weren't even able to begin the rehearsal until 10 p.m., at which point the lights went out because the union electricians were done for the day. They got the lights back on. They did their rehearsal. And the next evening, the show went on. Everyone was there in their jewels and their haute couture. The French portion came first. It lasted about 2 hours. When it was finally over, people rushed out to the lobby to get a drink. Um, and then the Americans came on, and they had this zippy 35-minute presentation. Liza Minnelli was there. She had just come off this huge triumph in Cabaret. She was singing and dancing. Their soundtrack was rock and roll and jazz. It it was a pre-recorded track with silences where changes were supposed to happen. So everyone really had to meet their marks. And it was a huge hit. The French jumped out of their seats. They threw their programs in the air. They shouted bravo. And then they rushed backstage to order clothes. So it was an incredible triumph. American designers who came after this, no one expected them to be copyists. It was a huge confidence boost. And it also predicted what came to pass, that fashion was now part of popular culture. The American designers were referencing contemporary music and film, not the Ancien Régime. And it was an assertion of what Elizabeth Hawes was saying in the 1930s, that the French legend only has power if you believe in it. Haute couture is not better. It's different. Ready to wear is not in second place. It's different.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end the story. I mean, this is conquering the French on their territory. Obviously, the French
Yeah,
act, they
it
don't go
was
away, right? But
it was a real smackdown. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and to have the French themselves cheering in their seats.
Yeah. Yeah. Apparently Princess Grace led the applause. She was there.
Well, that's a fitting enough way, I think, to turn now to Q&A.
Okay.
Um, we have a couple of questions, but I'll remind the audience that if you have questions, just use the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, and we'll take them as they come in. So the first question from Gary, no last name. What about the role of Hollywood fashion designers before and during and after the war?
Well, today we think of Hollywood fashion from the 30s and 40s as being incredibly beautiful, incredibly sophisticated. Fashion editors of the time really looked down their noses at it. They thought it was over the top. They thought it was tacky. They thought it was nothing like Paris. So they didn't really have a lot of respect for it. When the war began, however, they many of them actually traveled out to LA. Lois Long describes this in her column because they felt like fashion could not function unless it had these leaders. That's the way Paris fashion had always functioned. So they wanted the designers, the costume designers of Hollywood, to step into the role of the haute couturiers, to create these collections that could then be copied. This did not work out this way, in part because these designers were busy with other things and they were well compensated for being costume designers, but they'd also been snubbed for so long by New York media that they really weren't interested in participating. But it doesn't have the kind of impact that on high fashion that we might think it did. On everyday people who went to the movies to see glamour, yes, it did, but not on the New York media world.
Interesting. Linda Marie Grasso asks, can you comment on racial dynamics? I'm assuming the industry was as segregated as other areas of life. Were department stores like Lord and Taylor also segregated? And then she mentions Faith Ringwald's mother was a
Hmm.
fashion designer who worked primarily in Harlem.
Yeah.
Can you comment on her?
Yes, yeah, it was segregated. There were Black and designers and people of color who were designers. Many of them worked as small dressmakers rather than in the industry because it was segregated. This doesn't really start to change until after the war, but at the time it was. But you do see some encouraging signs. For example, when Eleanor Lambert put on fashion shows, she was hiring Black models as early as the 1940s.
Yeah.
Very, very unusual at the time. But yes, for the most part, the industry was segregated.
And we have a few slides here. I don't know if we want to sort of I think we got a little bit of time.
Sure, yeah, we can go
Maybe,
through them if you have
maybe
them.
we'd put a face to some of these names that we've been talking about.
Hmm.
So this is, excuse me for
No,
my
there's one before that if you want to go to it. I can talk a bit about the
uh yes, if I can just manage to do
Mhm.
two things at once.
It's
Sorry.
okay.
You all have to bear with my technical inabilities here. Um, give me a second. I don't know where that went. Um, not a fan of the. Anyway, let's go on to the next story.
Sure.
Next question, and I'll get these slides up in a second.
Okay.
Um, so next question. Uh, uh, Anonymous member of the audience writes, I've seen films about fashion designers, such as Designing Women, with the Lauren Bacall character designing clothes for a New York City department store.
Mhm.
Would such a designer get credit for designs in this period, or would the store?
It would depend how they were positioned and how the store considered them. For example, Sophie of Saks, she got her name on the label. For the most part, designers didn't, but Sophie of Saks was married to the owner of the store, so she had that advantage. Most designers did not have their names on the label. It took a very long time for this to happen. Um, they had their name on the label if they were couturiers like Elizabeth Hawes or Jessie Franklin Turner or Valentina. Claire McCardell was able to get her name on the label, but she had to really negotiate hard for it. Another American designer, Norman Norell, he got his name on the label, but he had to agree to take a lower salary in order to get it. So manufacturers were very reluctant to concede this to designers because they thought it would go to their heads and then they would be difficult to control. It starts to change more after the war.
So, and here we have Claire McCardle, one of the,
Yes. Yeah, that is actually Claire McCardle on I'm going to say the left. I hope I'm getting that right.
yes.
In a story that appeared in Vogue in 1945, and she's described as a designer for moderns. Journalists of the time are always using words like modern and even revolutionary. That comes up over and over
Mm,
again with her designs. So she's wearing this dress of her own design that Vogue describes as the future dress. They described it as being made of two triangles. That's not exactly correct. It's actually made of two squares of fabric turned on the diagonal with the bottom point cut off. And then one of them is tied at the back of her neck, the other one is tied at the front, and then it's belted. So it's like a dress that's an exercise in geometry, but it falls really beautifully. It's
mm,
only someone who was a very talented designer would be able to create a dress like this. You can't see it in the photo because it's black and white. This is true of fashion magazines into the 1970s. It was expensive and difficult to print color, so a lot of it
mm,
was black and white. It's a
mm,
rust-colored silk with white top stitching that kind of suggests jeans. So it always has this high-low
mm,
dynamic that American fashion does really well.
mm,
In the middle, that's one of her bathing suits. At a time when most bathing suits had a lot of structure and lining and boning and zippers, they were almost like dresses. She
yeah.
liked to use wool jersey for hers. So really, it's the equivalent of going swimming in a thin sweater. So when they
Mhm,
were wet, they could be quite revealing. But this is a very modern looking bathing suit from 1944. I think it's one of her diaper suits. Which had a panel of fabric that came down the back between the legs, and then you tied it around the waist. It was very nonchalant. It was very
mm,
sexy. She was known as a designer for the young and the bold, especially
mm,
with her bathing suits. And then on the right, this is one of her suits from 1944. This was called Revolutionary. It has a hood. She loved hoods. She even created a wedding dress with a hood. She thought this was a really practical. If you're outdoors and your ears are cold, you could flip your hood up.
yeah.
And she's wearing black tights. Nylons were taken off the market during the war because nylon was being used for the war effort.
And maybe just one more before we go back to questions, but here's Elizabeth Hawes.
Elizabeth Hawes, that's Elizabeth Hawes there on the left. Notice that she is wearing trousers and flat shoes in 1938. Those are both her own designs, these suspender slacks, and she called them pussyfoot shoes. They're kind of like ballet flats. And she's seated in this very modern piece of furniture. That is very much the Elizabeth Hawes aesthetic.
Mhm,
This is two of her designs in the middle. She really liked to give her dresses these kind of saucy names. The dress is called Alimony. It's an evening dress made of these many colors, and it has this little cape called Misadventure. And I have never seen this. I've seen an audio interview with a video interview rather with her son, who says that there's actually a handbag that she designed to go with this. It's made of suede and wood, and it's in the form of a penis and testicles. So she is, someone who's certainly got a sense of humor.
mhm,
On the right here, this is a wardrobe that she designed for this sportswoman. And again, trousers. Does she really liked the practicality of them? And you don't see so many of them. This is only 1933.
yeah, yeah. Interesting. Um, so next question. How influential were celebrities such as Jackie Kennedy on fashion design? That's a bit later in your story, but maybe celebrities at the time.
Celebrities at the time, it was, before the war, when we're talking about the fashion magazines and who they look to as style leaders, it was not celebrities in like a film star or a singer. It was a society leader, like Mrs. Harrison Williams, someone like that, because that's who they thought had true taste and true style. As I said, they did not think highly of Hollywood design or that some actresses they would feature them in the magazine, but before the war it was all about these society leaders. After the war and during the war, not to the extent that we have now. Jackie Kennedy is later, and she certainly had a huge impact on fashion. She consulted with Diana Vreeland about what she should wear.
Mhm.
And how she should be photographed. So, this story, all these women really are interwoven into the whole mid-century period. But it does not become a really big part of fashion magazines until much later. They're not certainly not on the cover. It's always going to be a model in who appears on the cover, not a celebrity.
Um, Deborah writes, how does the industrial movement via the Brooklyn Museum fit in with using museum artifacts to inspire fashion? And who was the innovator at the Brooklyn Museum?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what that is.
I'm not either.
Hmm.
Deborah, if you can give us a little more, please.
Hmm.
Rachel Gordon asks, how would you rate the New York department stores in the post-war years? Saks, Lord and Taylor, Bloom's.
Hmm. Well, they all had a very particular customer base. There were dozens and dozens, many more than the ones that we still know today that existed in New York. Saks was very upmarket, that had really society clientele. Macy's was known for its incredible bargains and sales. Lord and Taylor probably had the most desired clientele of all. They were very solidly middle class, interested in very good style. So they all had their own customer that they were appealing to.
Well, on that note, maybe let's continue with the slides here and make sure we can give Dorothy her due.
Mhm.
So next up we have Dorothy Shaver.
Yes, that
The
is Dorothy
story.
Shaver. I think she's in her office at Lord and Taylor in the 1940s. And this is one of her American look ads that I was describing from 1945. And this particular one is about the American college girl. And you can see the way she's being described as embodying all of these qualities that Lord and Taylor is looking for. I believe the illustrator here is Dorothy Hood, although I'm not completely sure. But you can also see that, it's just one ensemble. She's not putting lots and lots of different garments that they're selling into the ad. It's really about a feeling and a mood, and that's what she was talking about. The college shop at Lord and Taylor was incredibly influential. I don't know if it was the first one, but it certainly inspired a lot of imitators. And this was a department in the store that would sell clothing to girls who were going off to university. Although, of course, those were not the only people who shopped there. They would hire recent graduates, girls they thought had good taste. Sometimes Vogue or even Bazaar would poach staff from them. But they sold, separates, which were not a huge part of the industry at the time. The idea was that if you bought an outfit, you bought everything. You bought the jacket and the skirt and the blouse. Separates are just what they sound like. You can buy this skirt and that sweater, and you can make your own combinations. This was another thing that was promoted by the American look and by designers like Claire McCardell, that you are part of the conversation. You're not being dictated to.
Yeah, 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 very interesting. Um, shall we continue through our tour here?
Sure.
Um, Eleanor
Mhm.
Lambert.
Yes, that is Eleanor Lambert. The photograph was taken by her friend Cecil Beaton. And this was in the 1930s as she looked then. And this is a photograph of the audience at the Battle of Versailles. There are not a lot of photographs taken. That was just an agreement they made at the time. So we don't have a lot of imagery, and I don't think we have any film, as in a video of it, but this is the audience in the Théâtre Gabriel, which was this beautiful 18th century structure at Versailles.
Mhm.
And here are the Americans competing. There is Liza Minnelli. She's wearing
Liza.
Halston. They're singing and dancing. She wrote this. The first song was Bonjour Paris. Um, and then these are some of the models wearing some of the clothes from the evening gown portion. So, and they're at Versailles.
Hmm. So we have one more question, and then I think we may just call it an evening. And this is an anonymous attendee who wants to know, why haven't we mentioned Bergdorf Goodman?
Bergdorf Goodman, I would, there were so many things that I had to leave out. This could have been a multi-volume work. I really had to pare down what I was doing. Bergdorf Goodman was known for their custom workrooms. They copied haute couture clothes. Elizabeth Hawes actually worked for them one summer between semesters at Vassar. They would buy these haute couture originals, they would import them, and they would copy them for their customers. That's really what they were known for. They were a part of the carriage trade. I chose Lord and Taylor because Dorothy Shaver was such an influential retailer, and because of who the Lord and Taylor customer was and their incredible support for American designers. Bergdorf Goodman didn't have that kind of story.
Oh. Nancy, this is a truly very interesting book. I hope everyone goes out and buys it. You're a fantastic writer. No, truly, this is way outside of my usual area reading, but really interesting story. I'm, I was joking before the call, but I'm assuming I'm going to be having conversations with my partner about this for several weeks to come. Who's just started reading it herself.
Mhm.
I want to say thank you. I want to say congratulations. It's
Thank
getting
you
great
so
reviews.
much.
It deserves those reviews.
Thank you.
And I hope you'll stay in touch. And
Me
I
too.
encourage everyone to go by, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank
Thanks
you. And
for
thank you for
joining us.
everyone who logged in this evening to listen.
Yeah. Thanks to you all, and we will be back in a couple of weeks with another conversation, and we'll hope you join us then. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening as well, and thank you as always for your interest.
Thanks so much, Peter.
Good night.
Bye.